Elliot Vance had spent 3 years studying Astrathi linguistic structure, and he'd learned one fundamental truth. Their language was designed to prevent misunderstanding so effectively that translation into other languages became almost impossible without losing critical nuance. Every verb carried temporal markers that specified not just when something happened, but when the speaker believed it happened, when they learned it happened, and whether they had direct or indirect knowledge. Nouns had embedded relationship markers that clarified how the thing described connected to everything else in the sentence. Even simple statements contained layers of contextual information that human languages conveyed through implication and tone rather than grammatical structure, which was why he'd been hired as linguistic consultant for the treaty negotiations between the Terran Confederation and the Astrathi Empire. These negotiations had been ongoing for 8 months, working toward a trade agreement that could fundamentally reshape human expansion into resource-rich systems while giving the Astrathi access to human manufacturing technology that their own industrial base struggled to produce efficiently. The stakes were enormous: trillions in potential trade, strategic positioning for both civilizations, and the establishment of precedent for how humans and Astrathi would interact for generations. Elliot's role was purely technical. Make absolutely certain that every clause, every provision, every commitment in the treaty meant exactly the same thing in both languages. No ambiguity. No room for misinterpretation that could lead to conflict later when billions of credits and strategic resources were at stake. The work was meticulous and often tedious. He would spend hours reviewing single paragraphs, checking that the Astrathi temporal markers matched the human verb tenses, that relationship structures were preserved, that conditional statements had the same degree of firmness or flexibility in both versions. The diplomatic team often seemed frustrated by his insistence on precision. They wanted to move quickly, to finalize the agreement before political situations shifted on either side. But Elliot's supervisor, a veteran diplomat named Carrington who'd worked with the Astrathi for 20 years, backed him completely. Better to take time getting it right than to have it fall apart later because someone misunderstood their obligations, Carrington said whenever the team pushed for faster progress. During a critical session 3 weeks before the planned signing ceremony, Elliot was conducting his final comprehensive review of the entire treaty document, both versions side by side, checking one last time for any discrepancies before the text was locked for formal presentation. The human delegation and Astrathi negotiation team were present, going through their own final reviews, occasionally conferring about small adjustments to phrasing or clarifications of intent. Elliot was on Section 7, dealing with mutual assistance provisions in case either party faced security threats from third parties. The human version was clear. The parties shall provide mutual military and logistical assistance in the event of unprovoked aggression by external forces. Standard alliance language, creating binding obligation for both sides. He checked the Astrathi version. The translation looked accurate at first glance, same semantic content, proper grammatical structure. But something felt slightly off about the verb conjugation. He zoomed in on the temporal and obligation markers embedded in the Astrathi verb for provide. His stomach dropped. The Astrathi verb wasn't conjugated for firm future obligation. It was conjugated for conditional possibility dependent on circumstances. The difference was subtle, a single morphological marker, the kind of nuance that machine translation would miss entirely, that even competent human translators might not catch unless they were specifically checking for verb form precision. But it completely altered the meaning. The human version said, shall provide mutual assistance. The Astrathi version actually said, may consider providing assistance depending on evaluation of specific circumstances at time of request. One was binding commitment. The other was conditional possibility with significant flexibility to decline. Elliot stared at the discrepancy, his mind racing through implications. This wasn't just an error. This was a fundamental misalignment in what both parties thought they were agreeing to. If this went through, humans would believe they had secured a military alliance, while the Astrathi would believe they'd agreed only to consider potential assistance without firm obligation. The first time either side tried to invoke the mutual assistance clause, the entire treaty could collapse in mutual accusations of breach and deception. He looked up from his screen to where the senior human diplomat, Ambassador Reeves, was presenting some final clarification about commercial licensing procedures to the Astrathi delegation head. Everyone seemed satisfied with how the negotiations had proceeded. The signing ceremony was already scheduled. Media across both human and Astrathi space were preparing coverage of this historic agreement. Elliot raised his hand. Ambassador Reeves, I need to flag something in Section 7. The ambassador paused mid-sentence, clearly not expecting interruption during the final review session. Can it wait? We're almost through the... No, Elliot said firmly. It can't wait. There's a significant discrepancy in the mutual assistance clause. The human and Astrathi versions don't match. The room went very quiet. The Astrathi delegation head, a veteran negotiator named Corvesh, whose elongated ears expressed sudden sharp attention, set down his datapad carefully. Explain. Elliot explained. He walked them through the verb conjugation in the Astrathi text, showed exactly how the obligation markers differed from what the human version specified, demonstrated that this was not ambiguous interpretation, but clear grammatical structure conveying fundamentally different commitment levels. Ambassador Reeves's face went pale as the implications became clear. Several other human diplomats began frantically checking their own copies of the Astrathi text, trying to verify what Elliot was saying. Corvesh, meanwhile, had gone very still. His ears had flattened completely, an Astrathi expression Elliot recognized as profound displeasure. You present us with a treaty promising firm mutual defense obligations, he said slowly, his voice dangerous calm, while your own language version contains only conditional consideration of assistance. This is deliberate deception. No, Ambassador Reeves said quickly, this is clearly a translation error. We didn't... Your linguistic consultant identified it, Corvesh interrupted, which means your systems caught the discrepancy before finalization. Yet you said nothing until he forced the issue. That suggests you knew and were hoping we wouldn't notice. That's not what happened, Reeves protested. Elliot just found this now. We had no idea. Then your review process is catastrophically inadequate, Corvesh said. Either you attempted deliberate manipulation, or your diplomatic protocols are so flawed that you nearly locked both our peoples into a fundamentally misunderstood agreement. Neither possibility speaks well of negotiating in good faith. The Astrathi delegation head stood. We will need to suspend these negotiations pending full governmental review of the entire treaty document, every clause, every provision. If one section contains such significant error, we cannot trust that others are accurate. Corvesh, please, Ambassador Reeves said. This was an isolated mistake in the translation phase. We can correct it right now. We obviously intended firm mutual assistance, matching the Astrathi interpretation of, you intended what serves your strategic interests, Corvesh said coldly. As is your right, but you presented it in language suggesting firm obligation, while your own version maintained flexibility you did not disclose. Intentional or not, this requires formal review by our government and likely by Her Majesty Queen Serathis herself. He made a formal gesture of withdrawal. These negotiations are suspended. We will communicate our government's decision regarding whether to resume once full analysis is complete. The Astrathi delegation left. The room fell into chaos. Human diplomats arguing about how this had happened, who was responsible, whether the treaty could be salvaged. Ambassador Reeves turned to Elliot with an expression that combined gratitude and fury. You potentially saved us from disaster, he said, but you also just destroyed 8 months of work. I caught an error, Elliot said, trying to keep his voice steady. I reported it. That's my job. Your job, Reeves said tightly, is to support the diplomatic process, not derail it at the final stage. My job, Elliot corrected, is to ensure accurate translation so both parties understand what they're agreeing to. If I'd stayed quiet, this would have blown up the first time either side tried to invoke mutual assistance. At least now, there's a chance to fix it before the treaty is signed and implemented. Reeves looked like he wanted to argue, but Carrington stepped between them. He's right, Stephen. Better to catch it now than have it explode later. Painful, yes, but necessary. 3 days later, Elliot received the summons. The message came through official diplomatic channels, encoded with security protocols that indicated its significance. Elliot opened it in his small office at the Human Embassy compound, expecting some kind of debriefing request from his own government about the treaty situation. Instead, he found himself reading a formal summons from the Astrathi Imperial Court. Elliot Vance, linguistic consultant, Terran Confederation diplomatic mission. You are formally requested to appear before Her Majesty Queen Serathis at Imperial Court Session 2847A, scheduled for 7 days hence at the 3rd hour of formal proceedings. Your testimony is required regarding discrepancies identified in proposed treaty documentation between the Terran Confederation and the Astrathi Empire. Attendance is mandatory under provisions of diplomatic protocol. Failure to appear will be interpreted as hostile act. Acknowledgement of receipt and acceptance required within 24 hours. Elliot read it 3 times, his stomach sinking further with each pass. Queen Serathis herself, the absolute ruler of the Astrathi Empire, whose authority was so complete that even suggesting she might be wrong about something was considered treasonous by her own people. She was brilliant, everyone acknowledged that, but also unforgiving of what she perceived as deception or manipulation. Her court operated under protocols so ritualized and complex that careers were spent learning to navigate them properly. And she wanted Elliot to testify about the treaty error, not Ambassador Reeves, not the senior negotiators, him, the technical consultant who'd pointed out the problem. He reported the summons to Carrington immediately. His supervisor's reaction confirmed that this was exactly as serious as it seemed. "Christ," Carrington muttered, reading the summons on his own screen. "She's taking personal interest in this. That's either very good or catastrophic. Depends entirely on what she concludes about whether the error was intentional." "It wasn't," Elliot said. "It was translation failure. Automated systems missed the nuance. Human reviewers didn't catch it because they were checking meaning rather than precise grammatical structure." "You need to explain that to her," Carrington interrupted. Clearly, precisely, without any hint of evasion or excuse. Queen Serathis values truth above almost everything else. If she believes you're being honest, you'll be fine. If she suspects deception. He trailed off meaningfully. Over the following 7 days, Elliot received intensive briefing on Astrathi court protocol. An entire team of diplomatic specialists worked with him on proper forms of address, when to speak, and when to remain silent, the importance of maintaining appropriate physical distance from the throne, the formal gestures required for acknowledgement and respect. "Do not," his briefing officer emphasized repeatedly, "attempt to approach the throne or address the Queen directly unless explicitly invited. Everything flows through formal court procedure and the Queen's advisors. They will ask questions. You will answer them. The Queen may speak to you directly, but you respond through the court officials unless she specifically instructs otherwise. Breaking proximity protocols could be interpreted as threatening behavior." "I'm not going to threaten anyone," Elliot said. "I'm just going to explain what happened with the translation. The entire session will be broadcast across both human and Astrathi space," the briefing officer continued. "Billions will be watching. Your testimony could either salvage the treaty negotiations or confirm Astrathi suspicions that humans cannot be trusted in diplomatic agreements. No pressure, but literally, the future of human-Astrathi relations may depend on how you handle this." Elliot spent a sleepless night before the court session reviewing his analysis of the translation error, preparing explanations of Astrathi verb conjugation for an audience that would include billions who didn't speak the language, trying to figure out how to convey technical linguistic details in ways that demonstrated this was innocent mistake rather than calculated manipulation. The morning of the session, he dressed in formal attire that diplomatic staff had carefully selected to show respect for Astrathi court traditions without attempting to imitate their styles. He traveled to the Imperial Court complex in an official transport, accompanied by Ambassador Reeves and several other senior diplomats who would also be providing testimony. "Just tell the truth," Reeves advised. "Explain exactly what happened. Don't try to minimize or deflect. Queen Serathis respects directness." The throne room was vast and intimidating, designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant before the majesty of imperial power. The ceiling soared overhead, decorated with historical murals depicting centuries of Astrathi civilization. Columns of polished stone lined the space, each one carved with intricate patterns that probably conveyed meaning Elliot didn't have the cultural knowledge to interpret. The throne itself sat on an elevated platform at the far end of the room, constructed from some crystalline material that seemed to capture light and amplify it, making Queen Serathis appear almost luminous. She was younger than Elliot had expected, maybe 40 in human terms, though Astrathi aging was different enough that translating was imprecise. Her elongated ears were positioned in what his briefing identified as judicial assessment, neutral but intensely focused. She wore formal robes that looked simultaneously ancient and contemporary, marked with symbols of authority that probably took scholars years to fully understand. Around her, arranged in careful hierarchical patterns, stood dozens of advisors and court officials, each one positioned according to protocols Elliot couldn't begin to decode. The room was packed with observers, Astrathi nobility, human diplomatic staff, media personnel recording every moment for broadcast. Everyone watching to see if this human consultant could explain away what looked increasingly like deliberate treaty manipulation. Elliot took his position in the designated area for witnesses and tried not to look as terrified as he felt. The formal proceedings began with ceremony that seemed designed to emphasize the weight and significance of what was happening. Various court officials presented context about the treaty negotiations, the timeline of events, the discovery of the discrepancy. The human diplomatic team was invited to provide their perspective. Ambassador Reeves gave a carefully prepared statement about good faith negotiations, translation challenges between languages with fundamentally different structures, the regrettable but understandable mistake that had been caught before any agreement was finalized. The Astrathi negotiation team, led by Corvesh, presented their analysis with cold precision. They had reviewed the entire treaty document and found 17 additional discrepancies, none as significant as the mutual assistance clause, but enough to establish a pattern suggesting systemic failure at minimum and potentially deliberate manipulation at worst. The cumulative effect of these errors, Corvesh argued, would have given humans significant advantages in interpretation flexibility, while constraining Astrathi understanding of what they were agreeing to. "We do not allege deliberate deception," Corvesh said formally. "We simply present evidence that requires explanation. Either the Terran Confederation's diplomatic processes are catastrophically inadequate for agreements of this complexity, or there was intentional creation of asymmetric interpretive flexibility. Her Majesty must determine which explanation better fits the evidence." Throughout all of this, Queen Serathis remained silent, her ears expressing focused attention that felt like being studied under magnification. Her advisors leaned close periodically, whispering counsel that Elliot couldn't hear, but that seemed to generate considerable discussion based on their body language. Some advisors appeared skeptical of human explanations. Others seemed more sympathetic to the possibility of honest error. The Queen herself gave no indication of which interpretation she favored. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of testimony and presentation, Elliot was called forward to provide his technical analysis. He approached the designated position for witnesses, carefully measured to maintain proper distance from the throne as protocol demanded, and began explaining what he'd found. He walked through the Astrathi verb conjugation system, showed how the obligation markers worked, demonstrated exactly how the error had occurred in the automated translation phase, and why human reviewers had missed it when checking for semantic meaning rather than precise grammatical structure. "I found it," Elliot said, addressing the court officials who would relay his testimony to the Queen, "because I was specifically looking for verb tense inconsistencies. We'd had issues in earlier drafts where temporal markers didn't align properly, so I developed a checklist of high-risk grammatical structures to double-check. The mutual assistance clause fit that profile, complex obligation statement with embedded temporal markers. When I examined it closely, the discrepancy was obvious, but I understand why earlier reviewers missed it. They were checking whether both versions said the same thing conceptually. The problem was that they said similar things with completely different levels of binding obligation. One of the senior court advisors, a female Astrathi whose elaborate ear jewelry suggested high rank, stepped forward. "And why did you report this error when doing so would damage your own diplomatic mission's objectives?" "Because my job is ensuring accurate translation," Elliot said simply. "If I'd stayed quiet, and the treaty had been signed with that discrepancy, it would have caused much worse problems later when either side tried to invoke the mutual assistance provisions. Better to catch it and fix it now than to have it explode after implementation." Even knowing it might derail negotiations entirely, the advisor pressed. "Especially because of that," Elliot said. "A flawed agreement that falls apart is worse than no agreement. Both sides deserve to know exactly what they're committing to." He could see Queen Serathis' advisors leaning close to her, providing their interpretations and recommendations. Their whispered conversations seemed intense, with several advisors gesturing emphatically. The Queen listened without visible reaction, her expression neutral, her ears giving nothing away about what she was thinking. Then, as Elliot finished his explanation and waited for whatever judgment was coming, Queen Serathis did something that made every advisor around her freeze completely. She leaned forward. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in posture, her body inclining toward Elliot and reducing the carefully maintained distance between throne and witness by perhaps a foot. Maybe less. But the reaction was immediate and profound. Every advisor fell silent mid-whisper. Court officials stopped their subtle movements. The entire throne room became so quiet that Elliot could hear his own breathing, could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest. Hundreds of people watching in absolute stillness. The Queen was still leaning forward, her eyes locked on Elliot's face with intensity that made him feel transparent. And everyone was waiting for something, though Elliot had no idea what. In the silence, one of the senior advisors found his voice, speaking carefully. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should review the technical evidence more thoroughly before reaching any conclusions about." "No," Queen Serathis said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber with absolute authority that made the advisor fall silent immediately. "I will speak directly." She made a gesture toward Elliot, something formal that his briefing hadn't covered, but that seemed to carry profound significance based on the reactions rippling through the Astrathi court observers. Several looked shocked. Others appeared concerned. A few seemed almost approving. "Approach," the Queen commanded. Elliot hesitated, remembering his supervisor's explicit warning about maintaining distance from the throne, about never approaching without invitation. But this was an invitation, wasn't it? A direct command from the Queen herself. He looked at Ambassador Reeves, who nodded slightly, permission or encouragement or maybe just resignation that protocol had already been shattered. Elliot walked forward, closing the distance between witness position and throne, until he stood much closer to Queen Serathis than formal protocol would normally permit. Close enough to see the intricate patterns woven into her formal robes, close enough to meet her eyes without straining, close enough to feel distinctly uncomfortable with this proximity to absolute power. "Look at me," the Queen said. Elliot looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Her ears were positioned in a complex pattern he couldn't interpret, but her expression was intense, assessing him with the kind of attention that felt like his entire character was being evaluated in seconds. "In Astrathi court tradition," Queen Serathis said, speaking not just to Elliot but to the entire room, to the cameras broadcasting to billions across both civilizations, when a ruler leans forward before speaking, it signals intent to break from filtered communication. When she then calls a witness to proximity, it declares that what follows will be truth without the softening mediation of advisors and diplomatic courtesy. She paused, letting the significance of that sink in. Around the throne room, Astrathi court observers reacted visibly. This was clearly important, possibly unprecedented in recent history. "My advisors," the Queen continued, her gaze still locked on Elliot's face, "have provided numerous interpretations of the treaty situation. Some counsel that your people deliberately deceived us, creating asymmetric advantage through systematic translation manipulation. Others suggest sophisticated strategy to maintain flexibility while constraining our understanding. Several have advised that we should assume bad faith and permanently withdraw from negotiations with humans, protecting ourselves from peoples who cannot be trusted in formal agreements. Another pause. The silence felt solid, physical, but I lean forward now and speak directly because I choose to trust what I see and hear over what political calculation would have me assume. Queen Serathis' voice carried absolute conviction. You found an error that would have benefited your own side if left undiscovered. You reported it knowing it would cause problems for your diplomatic mission. You stand here now and explain exactly what went wrong without attempting to minimize, deflect, or obscure the failure. That is not the behavior of someone engaged in deception. That is the behavior of someone who values accuracy and truth over political convenience and personal advantage. She straightened slightly, though she maintained much closer proximity than formal protocol would normally allow. The treaty negotiations will continue. The errors will be corrected under your direct supervision. And I will remember that when given the opportunity to hide a problem or expose it, you chose exposure and accuracy despite the personal and professional cost. That speaks to integrity that your diplomatic corps should value rather than resent. Queen Serathis looked past Elliot to where the human delegation sat, her expression hardening. However, I also remember that your senior negotiators did not catch these errors, that your review processes failed multiple times, that it required a technical consultant, someone apparently regarded as less important than your primary diplomats, to prevent a fundamentally flawed agreement. Your diplomatic practices require significant improvement if you wish to negotiate agreements of this complexity with peoples whose languages demand precision you seem unprepared to provide. Back to Elliot, her voice softening slightly. You, however, have my respect and my thanks. You may have caused temporary crisis, but you prevented lasting disaster. You chose truth when silence would have been safer for your career. That deserves public recognition. She made another formal gesture, something that caused ripples of reaction through the Astrathi court officials, whispered conversations starting and dying quickly. I extend to you the Queen's recognition, a formal acknowledgement that you have served truth over politics, accuracy over convenience. This will be recorded in court archives. You will be remembered as someone who chose integrity when deception would have been easier and professionally safer. Elliot, stunned and completely unsure how to respond to being publicly praised by an absolute monarch in front of billions, managed. I was just doing my job, Your Majesty, checking translations, making sure both sides understood the actual agreement rather than what they hoped it said. Yes, Queen Serathis said. You were doing your job with integrity and precision. That should not be as rare as it is, but it is rare, and therefore worth recognizing publicly. She leaned back, resuming her full formal position on the throne, the physical distance returning as protocol reasserted itself. But something fundamental had shifted. The entire tone of the proceedings had transformed from accusatory examination to acknowledgement of problem solved. The Astrathi Empire will resume treaty negotiations with the Terran Confederation, the Queen announced formally. All discrepancies will be corrected under the supervision of linguistic consultant Elliot Vance, whose analysis and integrity we now trust. We expect human diplomatic leadership to grant him whatever authority is necessary to ensure accuracy. Any future negotiations between our peoples will include him or someone of equivalent skill and integrity in critical translation oversight. She made a gesture of dismissal. These proceedings are concluded. The record will reflect our findings and decisions. Over the following months, as treaty negotiations resumed and eventually concluded successfully, with Elliot checking every single clause personally and flagging 17 additional minor discrepancies that got corrected before finalization. The story of what happened in the throne room became legendary in diplomatic circles across both human and Astrathi space. The moment when Queen Serathis leaned forward, when the advisors fell silent, when proximity replaced the safety of distance and filtered communication, when truth was spoken directly because that's what the situation demanded rather than what political calculation suggested. Elliot never became comfortable with the recognition or the elevated status that followed. He was still fundamentally a linguistic specialist who cared more about verb conjugations than political positioning. He just wanted to make sure the translation was accurate, that both sides understood what they were committing to, that the agreement wouldn't fall apart due to fundamental misunderstanding of obligations. But he carried with him the memory of Queen Serathis leaning forward, choosing to speak directly rather than through the careful filters of advisors and diplomatic courtesy, declaring publicly that his integrity mattered more than the diplomatic mess it had temporarily created. 6 months after the throne room session, when the finalized treaty was signed with great ceremony and media coverage across both civilizations, Queen Serathis requested Elliot's presence at the signing, not as background technical staff, but as honored guest, seated in a position of prominence usually reserved for senior diplomats and political leadership. During the formal reception following the signing ceremony, the Queen approached him directly, another breach of normal protocol that made court observe.